I'm Glenn Campbell with a superficial tourist guide to Eastern Europe. That's right, I'm going to cover the whole half of a continent in a single video. And you may say this is impossible, but this is a superficial video. It's just skipping along the surface. I'm just going to give you something called perspective on the entire region. You're not going to get any pretty pictures in this video. This is just me talking. I'm not giving you any visual aids in this video deliberately. In these superficial guides, I'm just talking because the visual aids will only distract you. But I do have plenty of visual aids available. I have an Instagram account with thousands of videos and photos from my travels, and they're very easily indexed through hashtags, so you can pull up all of my photos from Ukraine and all my videos from Ukraine using a certain hashtag. So my Instagram account is Bad Dalai Lama, like the good Dalai Lama, but bad. Look it up and then you will be able to see all my photos and videos from Ukraine and all of the other Eastern European countries that I'm talking about. First of all, should you come to Eastern Europe? Well, no, it should not be your first stop in Europe. First, you should be seeing Western Europe. You think places like London, Paris, Rome. Those are more culturally significant. But after you've seen these places, then you may want to look east. And the reason you might want to look east is there's a lot of beautiful stuff here, but it's also very cheap. It's maybe a 30% or to 50% cheaper in Eastern Europe than in Western Europe. You can get for example, in Eastern Europe, it's not uncommon to get a $25 hotel room or a $10 hostel bed in Eastern Europe, and food prices are lower. So your travel money goes a lot further in Eastern Europe. But it's also kind of a rich and interesting environment. First of all, let's define Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe, to me, is all the countries that were once under Soviet domination. And I'm also going to throw in Greece and Turkey. I think they're more similar to Eastern Europe than to Western Europe. So what I'm going to do in this video is first I'm going to give you an overview of all of Eastern Europe, and then I'm going to drill down to individual countries. And from memory alone, I'm going to go through all the countries of Eastern Europe and tell you about the highlights and maybe the lowlights and what you should see and what you should focus on in each of these countries. So let's start with the overview. Eastern Europe. All of Eastern Europe, apart from Turkey and Greece, share this common heritage. And this heritage is 50 years of oppression. Starting with the Nazis and then following with the Soviets, that only ended in the late 80s and early 90s. So these were prison countries at one point, and in the 90s there was a great blossoming, a great euphoria of freedom in the 1990s. And suddenly these countries were part of the larger world. They started developing tourist infrastructure, and basically the sky was the limit back in the 1990s. Since then, in the 21st century, there has been a slow decline. And it's really hard to notice in the cities, but it's more obvious in the countryside. The countryside is emptying out throughout Eastern Europe. All of Eastern Europe has got demographic problems. There are not enough babies in Eastern Europe to refresh the population. In addition, talented young people are leaving Eastern Europe in droves, and they're moving to better opportunities in Western Europe, because if country is a part of the EU, citizens can freely leave and go and work in London or Paris or Germany. So one of the effects of this horrible demography is you've got tons and tons of abandonment in Eastern Europe. You've got all sorts of abandoned houses and factories and train stations. They're everywhere in rural areas. You don't see much of it in the big city, but in smaller towns and in the countryside, you see a lot of abandoned buildings. So part of the charm of Eastern Europe, for me, is exploring some of these old abandoned buildings. If you see an abandoned building on the side of the road, stop and check it out. The main tourist attractions in Eastern Europe are medieval cathedrals and castles and monasteries, but you also find some even older attractions like this Flintstones gas station in Bulgaria. But I want to show you the stairway on the back of this gas station, because this is kind of symbolic of what the rules are like in Eastern Europe. Notice the stairway, there is no railing, there's no keep out sign. You can basically go and fall off if you want, because they're not going to protect you. There are fewer rules here and probably fewer lawyers to sue people. So that's kind of a refreshing part of Eastern Europe, being able to do what you want without too many rules. You can hurt yourself, but you can also do a lot of things you can't do back home. One misconception about Eastern Europe is that it is somehow unsafe, less safe than Western Europe, and that's wrong. I find myself feeling completely safe in Eastern Europe. I feel that I am safer in Europe as a whole, anywhere in Europe, than I am in the United States. Safer from crime. Violent crime is really unknown here. It's extremely rare. There's a little bit of property crime in that if you leave your car with your valuables exposed in a remote hiking trailhead, well, you might get your car broken into. But this is only common sense. You don't want to leave valuables in plain sight in a car, and you want to take reasonable precautions to protect your property anywhere in the world. That there are pickpockets in tourist areas, but there are pickpockets in Italy and everywhere else. You make sure your pocket can't be picked. Other than those little things, you're really safe in Eastern Europe. You're going to find people are more likely to be helpful than rude. For example, I'm here in Bulgaria. This is a hostel in Bulgaria. And yesterday I had a flat tire, and some workers flagged me down. They didn't speak English, but they flagged me down to point out my flat tire. And then they insisted on changing the tire for me. These are just road workers along the side of the road. They insisted on changing my tire for me, even though I didn't want it or ask for it. So you do find a lot of friendliness in the countryside. How do you communicate with people? What is the language of Eastern Europe? Well, there's a lot of languages of Eastern Europe. Fortunately, English gets you by just about everywhere. English is the second language of Europe. If you've got a German talking to a Spaniard, they're going to talk to each other in English. English is the language of Europe. Anywhere in Eastern Europe, anyone who's dealing regularly with tourists is going to speak English, or enough English to get things done. You go off into the countryside, and of course, they won't speak English. But you should still try. The common wisdom that is conveyed to you in conventional tourist guides is that you should learn some of the language, because the locals will appreciate you trying to speak their language. And I think that's bullshit. I think that you should speak English and speak it clearly and speak it from the start, because you want to remove ambiguity. So when you first meet someone, you want to make it clear to them that you don't speak their language and that you speak English. And the clue that I give them is I simply say hello. When I pass someone in the street in Bulgaria, I say hello. And that clues them into the fact that you speak English, because everyone knows hello is English. To speak one or two words of the language is worse than not speaking it at all. For example, if you're in Paris and you say bonjour to someone you pass, well, he's going to start jabbering at you in his Frenchy talk, and he's not going to know that you don't speak French. So when you pass someone in the street in Paris, you say hello, and then they know something about who you are. And the same as in Eastern Europe. There's no way you're going to learn all these languages of Eastern Europe unless you stay for a long time in one of them. So just say hello and talk to people clearly in English. I do this all the time in supermarkets. You go up to the deli in the supermarket, and you point to what you want, and you say, can you give me one of those? And you speak in English. There's a good chance they'll know what you're saying if you speak clearly and use finger pointing and other things. It's really easy to get along that way, even in places where people don't speak English. So one thing you can learn is the Cyrillic alphabet. That's the alphabet used in about 6 Eastern European countries: Belarus, Ukraine, Bulgaria, and a couple of countries down in the Balkans. It's pretty easy. Each of those funny letters corresponds to a letter or a sound in English, and you can look up a chart of those sounds on the internet, and you can learn Cyrillic in about an hour. If you do learn it, then you can decode quite a few road signs and business signs like pharmacy and supermarket. You can figure those out just by knowing Cyrillic. So here's some classic Bulgarian abandonment along the highway. Let's talk about transportation. Planes, trains, buses, automobiles, and bicycles. You're going to get to Europe by a plane. You're going to get to Eastern Europe by a plane. There's a lot of ground to cover in Eastern Europe. The trains tend to be slow. The roads aren't particularly fast. So you want to get between major points in Eastern Europe. You want to fly. You want to go from Prague to Kiev. You fly, and there's lots of cheap airlines. There's lots of cheap airfares. I would first check your standard booking sites like Expedia, and then look for cut-rate airlines. Some cut-rate airlines like Ryanair are not listed on Expedia, so you have to kind of hunt for these regional cut-rate airlines. Maybe in the description below, I will give you a link to a list of cut-rate airlines. The train system in Eastern Europe is quite extensive, although there are gaps. In some places there are maybe trains only 2 or 3 times a week. For example, between Moldova and Bucharest. And some places there are no trains at all, and you have to rely on buses, and the buses are very good. What's nice about the transportation is it's very cheap. A day-long train trip could be $25 or less. The downside is these trains have seen better days. Some of the coaches are from the Soviet era. Some of the trains are kind of uncomfortable and rickety, and they move slowly, but they're cheap. Buses tend to be more modern. They're also cheap, but they'll get you there in a little bit more style, and you very well might see more things from a bus than you see from a train, because if you can get a front seat in the bus, you can look out the front of the bus, whereas on the train, just things tend to whiz right by. And then there's rental cars. And there's basically 2 ways to see Europe. You can see it as a pedestrian using public transportation, in which case you go to the big cities, or you see it in a rental car, in which case you're visiting the countryside. In most of Europe, it's hard to do both. You can't, for example, drive in a rental car around Spain and expect to visit Barcelona, because Barcelona is a traffic nightmare and a parking nightmare. So you can't mix the two in Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, it's a little bit easier to. The cities aren't quite as dense. The parking isn't quite as expensive. You can, for example, visit Budapest in a rental car. Visit Prague and get fairly close to the old city in Prague in a rental car. But mostly you want to keep them separate. Either you're going to visit the city of Prague, in which case you stay locally and don't have a car, or you're going to visit the countryside of the Czech Republic, in which case you definitely do need a car. The difference between having a rental car and traveling by train is that the train whizzes right by things that you might want to stop at. And in a rental car, you have the chance to start and stop as you please and go to places that the train doesn't serve. I always rent through the Expedia website of the UK. So expedia.co.uk, not the expedia.com website of the USA, because European websites will give you free insurance with every rental. Now, insurance is covered by my credit card, but I would rather have it covered explicitly in the contract. And so if you rent through Expedia.uk, you're going to get free insurance with the rental. And I'm only going to rent from the major companies. I'm renting from Hertz, Avis. Sixt car rental is okay. You want to rent from a car rental company that you've heard of and not some local car rental company, because you might get hustled. I've just had some bad experience with local car rental companies. They insisting, for example, that I buy their insurance, even though I bought insurance through Expedia. Your insurance is going to have a deductible called, I forget what they call it, an excess charge. So for example, it might be €1,000 or €500. That's the amount that you're responsible for if you take an accident. And of course they'll sell you a waiver that lets you ignore that. But I find €500 or €1,000 is an acceptable risk level for me. And what they'll do is they'll put a hold on your credit card for that amount. And for that, I use the credit card that gives me the free car rental, the free rental car insurance. I use that for that €1,000 hold. The car rental prices themselves are quite reasonable. You have to be willing to drive a manual shift. Throughout Eastern Europe, they do have automatic cars, but they're more expensive. So if you want the cheaper rental cars, you have to be able to drive stick. When you rent a car, you always want to be conscious of the geographical restrictions on the rental. Typically, you have unlimited kilometers within the country where you rented the car, but even when there aren't any borders, the rental car company may restrict you to certain countries. One country you can rent in is Germany. If you rented a car in Berlin, you can take it to a lot of countries of Eastern Europe and then return it to, as long as you return it to Berlin. Most cities have very good public transportation systems, be it a metro or a tram system or buses, and they're all very cheap. You have to figure out how the system works for paying, whether you're going to buy tickets or use a machine or buy tickets on the bus. That you have to figure out when you get there, and you can, if you go to a hostel, you can ask about that at the hostel. Bicycle, very good transportation option. Once you get to a city, check into a hostel, rent a bicycle for a day, and you can see a lot more of the city than you can see on foot. I've rented bicycles in Madrid and Prague and all over the place, and it's for $10 a day you can ride a bicycle all up and down a city and see a much broader swath of it than you can on foot. Money in Eastern Europe. Many countries in Eastern Europe are part of the EU. Some of those are part of the Eurozone, meaning they're using the euro as their currency, which makes everything easy. You don't have to change money. I forget how many countries are using the euro. Use your Google to look that up and find out what the currency is in each of these countries. When you need currency, easiest way to do it is just an ATM. Like at the airport, use an ATM. Be sure to notify your bank that you're traveling. There's a notification portal in most bank websites. You just tell them you're going to Bulgaria. You can use credit cards. In Eastern Europe, you can't count on being able to use credit cards, for example, at a hostel or hotel, so you should carry the local currency. Where should you stay in Eastern Europe? I have three methods. I stay in a lot of hostels. This is a very nice hostel in Veliko Tarnovo. It's only about $12 a night. Hotels will run you can get a nice hotel room in many places for $25 a night. How do you book a hotel? Just use Expedia or any common booking site. I often do it on the day of I need the lodging. I'll look up on my smartphone go to Expedia on my smartphone and book something right away. And often 25, 30. Even in a city like Prague, you can get good accommodations, a good hotel room for $50 a night. That's the advantage of Eastern Europe. So I stay in hostels, I stay in hotels. If I am renting a car, I can sleep in the car. I'm very comfortable doing that, sleeping in the back of the car. I feel completely safe. There's a whole skill involved in learning how to sleep in a car. I cover that in other videos. I'll provide a link down below. But basically, you kind of scrunch up in the fetal position, and eventually you can train your body to get a good night's sleep in a rental car. There's camping. That requires that you have a tent or an RV. There are a lot of campgrounds around. Many campgrounds will rent you a tent. They have tents all set up, and you can rent them sort of like hostel accommodations. And you can look that up on any hostel booking site like hostelworld.com is a good hostel booking site. I never really worry about accommodations before I come. I worry about having a rental car, and I worry about my accommodations for the first night I arrive. Other nights I just wing it. And you can generally wing it except in July and August, where everybody is on vacation and hostels book up and hotels may book up. So if you're traveling in July and August, you may have to think things through a little bit better. But the rest of the year, I just kind of wing it, and I come up with the accommodations I need on the fly on the day that I need them. When should you visit Eastern Europe? How about the summer? Summer is it's June right now. Summer it's beautiful throughout Eastern Europe, and Bulgaria it's all very green in Bulgaria. But the trouble is, July and August, everybody travels. It can get crowded. I prefer the shoulder seasons. May and June, September and October are still beautiful in Eastern Europe. I would avoid winter. Much of these landlocked countries are in a continental climate zone, which means Kiev can be as cold as Moscow, Minsk. It's just not pleasant traveling in the winter. Part of what makes it unpleasant is the days aren't very long. In the winter time, you don't have a lot of light to tour by. So I tend to avoid at least the northern part of Eastern Europe in the winter time. It's better down south in Greece, for example, in the winter can be quite pleasant. But generally speaking, you want to travel in the spring, summer, or fall. Food in Eastern Europe. They tell me the food in Eastern Europe is wonderful, but I wouldn't know because I very rarely sample it. I am not a food adventurer. Food just complicates things for me. So I eat whatever it is convenient to eat to maintain my body. I'm one of these guys who eats to live. I don't live to eat. So I cannot advise you about restaurants and foodstuffs of any kind because I do very rarely partake. All I can tell you is that restaurants are cheap. As long as you have an income from North America or Western Europe, you can get a pretty good meal for a very reasonable price. And all of it is safe. The drinking water is safe, the tap water is safe, the food is safe. You're not going to get any major diseases here. Is there corruption in Eastern Europe? I don't think it's anything you need to worry about as a tourist. Some countries are more corrupt than others, but I don't think it's something that you have to deal with. Mainly corruption would consist of a taxi driver charging you too much. And you avoid that by using Uber. So as long as Uber is in many cities like Prague or in Warsaw, you have Uber or some equivalent of Uber. And you just use that, and then you know what you're paying. I had only one incident of police corruption in all my history of traveling in Eastern Europe, and this was actually back right after the fall of communism in the early 1990s. I was driving in Hungary. I took an illegal left turn. A policeman saw me, jumped out of his car, and started yelling at me and demanded money. A certain number of Deutschmarks, which was, the German currency at the time, and he demanded it in cash. I gave him this, 60 Deutschmarks in cash. He gave me receipts for the money, and the receipt only was added up to 30 Deutschmarks. So the cop kept the rest. And I don't expect that today. I expect that this police corruption isn't really a major factor anymore. But I obey the traffic laws, and I try to obey the speed limit and not take illegal turns. Internet. You have many options on internet. You could live without internet, which to me is intolerable. So you may be able to use your home cell phone in Europe. My plan with Verizon allows me to use my Verizon phone in most countries of the world for $10 a day. So I can make unlimited calls for $10 a day and use supposedly unlimited internet. The trouble is Verizon gives you only a half gig a day, and I don't know any human being who can survive on a half a gig a day. I need more gigs. So the other options are you buy a SIM card, which can be very affordable. It might be $20 for 10 gigs of computing power. And these are very commonly available in central cities and at the airports. You can also, if you're renting a car, very often the rental car company will rent you a hotspot for a reasonable price, maybe $5 or $6 a day. You can get a hotspot that gives you internet. And most hotels and hostels will have internet as well. So now we're done with the general section on Eastern Europe. Let's go through each country individually. And I'm going to do this from memory. I'm going to go from north to south. And I hope I remember all of these countries. If there's something I left out or something I got wrong, I'm going to make a note about it in the description below. So starting in the north, up in the north, there are the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Estonia is the topmost, the northernmost. It's right across the strait from Helsinki. So you can take a 2-hour ferry from Helsinki to Tallinn, Estonia. Or if you're in Tallinn, you can do a day trip to Helsinki. The main difference, the main shock between Helsinki and Tallinn is the big price change. So in Helsinki, all the prices are going to be astronomical. They're maybe 50% higher than what you would expect in the United States. And you go down to Estonia and all the prices are very reasonable, and they're like 30% lower than what you expect in the United States. So there's kind of a culture shock there. The old city of Tallinn is quite charming. It's a walled city. Tallinn doesn't deserve more than a day or two, but it's a very nice city. It has a nice old city you can walk around. And frankly, no city in Eastern Europe really needs more than a couple of days. 3 days for Prague is sufficient, but most cities you can do in a couple days. I wouldn't linger in any one city for very long because there's other things to do. So Tallinn, Estonia is nice. It's a nice stopping point, a nice place to rent a car perhaps. If you rent a car, your car can generally only be taken to the Baltic countries. So Tallinn is nice, no more than a day in Tallinn. You can head south to Riga. I think Riga is overhyped. It has a nice old town, but there really isn't a lot to see or do in Riga. Let me tell you something about geography, about landforms. All of the world's landforms can be divided up into flat areas and mountainous areas. And to me, mountainous areas are always more interesting because humanity has kind of had to make accommodations for the mountains. A village might be crammed into a gorge, or there might be a castle on the top of a mountain. That happens in mountainous regions. In flat regions, you don't have as many interesting things going on because it's flat and there's no high points or low points, and people haven't been as innovative in their medieval architecture, for example. The trouble with the Baltic states is it's pretty flat out there, so there's not a lot of interesting stuff. Going south from Riga, from Latvia, you get into Lithuania. The capital of Lithuania is Vilnius. And Vilnius is built on hills, so it's a little bit more interesting than any place else in the Baltics. So I like Vilnius. There's a fortress on top of a hill in Vilnius. So I would, if you're going to spend any time in the Baltics, I would spend more time in Vilnius, maybe 2 or 3 days in Vilnius. I rented a bicycle in Vilnius and rode all around. Since it's kind of mountainous, it's kind of, you need a lot of energy to rent a bicycle, but it was worthwhile, and I had a good time in Vilnius. Continuing to the southwest, we have Poland. Poland is very flat. It tends to be not a lot of relief. There are mountains in Poland, not a lot of them. So I found Poland kind of boring. I do not recommend Poland for the first time visitor. Warsaw is kind of a boring city. It's flat. Warsaw has an old town, but it's a new old town because the Nazis flattened the old town. So the new old town is reconstructed, is rebuilt, and it's not as interesting as a real old town. In Poland, I can't think of too many attractions. There's the Auschwitz concentration camp. I did not go there. I've been to one other concentration camp, and believe me, one concentration camp is enough. It's just very emotionally draining. Everywhere you go in Eastern Europe, you're going to see monuments to the Holocaust, to places where Jews were killed. It's very depressing. It's just a fact of life here. I don't like to dwell on it, so I don't see all the concentration camps. You see one concentration camp, that may be enough. But if you're going to see one, I guess it should be Auschwitz. It's near Krakow. Also near Krakow is a very nice salt mine where you can go underground, and there's a underground chapel and things, underground sculptures in this historical salt mine. I forget what the name of the salt mine is, but it's near Krakow. Other than that, Poland is not a high value target. I would skip Poland. Don't hit it on an early visit. Maybe later visits, but it's not a high priority. Over to the east, there's Belarus. First, let's talk about Russia. Why won't I go to Russia? Well, the problem is the visa. The visa requires all sorts of personal information. It requires that you have a sponsor within Russia, and that may seem insurmountable if you're just a tourist and you don't know anybody, but your sponsor can be your hostel. And for example, the hostel can give you a letter of sponsorship for, I think, $35. So that's one step in a very complicated visa process. The other problem of the visa in applying for a visa is that you have to have your plane ticket before you even apply for the visa. Before you even know whether you're going to get in, you have to have a plane ticket. So if you're spending hundreds on a plane ticket, that's a big risk that you're taking. Because the airline won't give you a refund. If you can't get a visa, the airline will not give you a refund. So what I would do is I would buy the cheapest possible ticket into Russia, and that would be either from Riga or maybe from Warsaw. Air Baltic flies into Russia. So that's what I would use I would buy that ticket so that if I didn't get a visa, I haven't wasted a lot of money. And then in this form, you've got to reveal all sorts of personal information to the Russian government. Information that I wouldn't give to my own government. And basically, they want to know your source of income so you don't overstay and try to find work in Russia. And they want to know every place that you've lived, and they want to know what your assets are, what real estate holdings are. So I filled out this form as best I could. I kind of fudged it where I needed to. And then what happened is they called me in for an interview in New York City. So I was supposed to report to New York City to the consulate there so that I could have a face-to-face interview with a consular officer to get my stupid tourist visa. And that's where I drew the line, and I said, I'm not going to do this. Russia is not worth it. Russia is it's a politically difficult place. It's a totalitarian regime. Do I really want to go there, and do I want to spend all this, really hundreds of dollars, to get this visa? So the visa fee alone is something like $100, and then there's the fee of the agent that's processing the visa, and then there's the fee of the sponsorship letter, and the fee of the costs of buying this airline ticket that you might not even use. So I just said, fuck it. I don't want to deal with Russia, and I'm not going to deal with Russia until they offer a visa-free option, which is just not going to happen anytime in the near future. So don't go to Russia. But Belarus is a different story. Belarus used to have the same visa regimen as Russia. You had to have a sponsor, and you had to fill out this complicated form. But only a couple of years ago, they opened themselves up to tourism to a limited extent by offering a 5-day visa-free stay. There are restrictions on this program. You have to arrive at the main national airport. You can't visit Belarus by land. You have to come by air. Another requirement is that you have proof of health insurance. And this kind of panicked me at first. How do I prove that I have health insurance that's valid in Belarus? So I arranged travel insurance, and I thought that would do the trick. It turns out that the health insurance is sold right there in the airport just before customs. And it's very cheap. It's only like $5 a day for this health insurance voucher. And then you just take the voucher over to customs, and that's all that they require. They stamp your passport and look at this voucher, and then they let you in for 5 days. And you can do a lot in 5 days. Minsk is really, you can do Minsk in a couple of days. I spent 5 days in Minsk. I had a nice time. Minsk is very cheap. I think I took out $80 or less from my ATM in local currency, and $80 covered everything for 5 days. It covered my hostel, it covered all my food, and I had money left over to have a really nice restaurant meal on my last day. So Belarus is cheap. It's not terribly exciting, though. The capital of Minsk is what I imagine Moscow is like. It's big, very nice, big, blockish Soviet kind of architecture. They have an old city, but it's like Poland, like Warsaw. It's a reconstructed old city. They have some very nice parks. I rented a bicycle in Minsk and had a very nice time. But really the only reason I was going there is to fill in my map, to say that I've been to all of these countries. And other than that, Belarus was not too exciting. The next time I go, if I go again, I would use my 5 days to rent a car and drive around the countryside. But it's a big country. I'm not expecting big things that I can't find elsewhere. So for now, just skip Belarus. Going over to the east again, the Czech Republic. So if you go anywhere in Eastern Europe, it should be Prague. It's heavily touristed, but there's also a lot of things to see and do. It's a very nice city on a river. What is the river? Quick, what is the river of Prague? Is it the Danube? I don't know. It's a famous river. There's a very nice old town. There's the Charles Bridge where everyone takes pictures. There's lots of viewpoints, towers that you can climb, lots of nice little museums. The museums are cheap, so you might as well go to them. Some of the museums that I remember are the Franz Kafka Museum, about that surrealist guy, and the Zellman Museum of special effects, about special effects that were used before the digital era in movies. So there's plenty to occupy you in Prague. You could spend a week in Prague and find plenty of things to do, but I think 2 or 3 days is enough. Lots of hostels in Prague, lots of cheap accommodations, prices are low. If you have the occasion to rent a car, there are things to see in in the Czech Republic. I find it very nice. Some of the highlights in the Czech Republic are the Bone Church, and I forget what the name of the Bone Church is, but it's near Kutná Hora, maybe a couple hours out of Prague. This is a church with a crypt full of bones of thousands of individuals, all nice, neatly stacked and arranged, and that's quite memorable. There's a cathedral in Kutná Hora, but there are cathedrals everywhere. Another memorable site in the Czech Republic is a nice medieval village called Cesky Krumlov. It's built on a bend of the river, and there's lots of nice relief there, and a big castle on a hilltop and a tower you can climb. I'd say a day in Cesky Krumlov would be nice. A lot of other places in Czech Republic I haven't been, but it's a pretty good place, a pretty good, a nice place to rent a car and just drive around. Slovakia, next to the Czech Republic and just south of Poland. Slovakia. And quick, what's the capital of Slovakia? It is Bratislava. I've stayed in Bratislava a couple of times, don't really remember it. There's not much memorable about it. It's got an old town like any other. The most memorable thing about Bratislava is its UFO bridge, a bridge over the Danube River, that with a shape with a restaurant that looks like a UFO at the top of it. That's all there is to remember about Bratislava. Nice countryside in Slovakia. There's mountains that border Poland called the Slovakian Paradise. It's nice mountains. It's a nice area. Not particularly memorable. So skip Slovakia. In fact, so far, skip all of the places that I've talked about so far except the Czech Republic. What is east of Slovakia is the Ukraine. Ukraine is a big area, a big, mainly agricultural area. It's the wild west of the east. I have not been to most of Ukraine. I've been to Kiev several times. I've taken a train from Kiev to Odessa, which is on the sea, on the Black Sea. Never got to Crimea before Russia took it over. And now if I'm going to go to Crimea, I need the darn Russian visa. Oh, by the way, I forgot a little piece of Russia that's right up near Lithuania. Wedged between Lithuania and Poland is a little wedge, a little piece of Russia called Kaliningrad. And I don't know why you would want to go there, but you need your full Russian visa to go there. There's no day tripping to Kaliningrad. You just got to go around it between Lithuania and Poland. So I can't talk about Kaliningrad. But I can talk about the Ukraine. So Kiev is a nice city, very inexpensive. One reason to be visiting Kiev would be to take a day tour to Chernobyl, the Chernobyl dead zone, exclusion zone, this whole big vast area that's been closed off after the Chernobyl accident. And you can go to the main town of Pripyat, which is an abandoned ghost town. Now, I should warn you that about 3 years after I went to Chernobyl, I got cancer. And I beat cancer, but I can't say for certain that Chernobyl didn't cause my cancer. So I'm not, normally I'd be recommending that you visit Chernobyl because it's really cool. But on the other hand, I don't want you to get cancer. So if I were to go to Chernobyl again, what I would buy in America is I would get my very own dosimeter, my very own Geiger counter to carry with me to Chernobyl just to confirm that radiation is within acceptable limits. When you take a tour of Chernobyl, the guide has a dosimeter and he points out places that are hot. But I would like to have my own dosimeter before I visit Chernobyl again. There's a nice rustic village in the suburbs of Kiev. There's a nice rustic village of traditional houses, a traditional village in I forget what it's called, but it's on the outskirts of Kiev. So I've spent about a week in Kiev, and I enjoyed it. I had a good time. There are things to do, mostly concerning Chernobyl. There's a nice nuclear museum in Kiev. Chernobyl itself is a couple hours drive north of Kiev. But this would be included in your day tour. You do arrange this day tour while when you're in the city. You don't have to arrange it in advance. So I took a train trip from Kiev to Odessa. I checked Google. I checked Google Maps to tell me about this train trip, and the Google Maps was telling me that it was about an 8-hour train trip. Turns out it was more like a 20-hour train trip. Very cheap, but it was a very cheap price, like $25 for a sleeper car from Kiev to Odessa. Very enjoyable, but I was taken aback by the train schedules. So it's really hard in Eastern Europe to find out about trains because they're stuck in the 20th century, and their schedules may not be online. I've had a lot of surprises where I thought there would be a train and there wasn't. Or this thing in Ukraine where the train ride was a lot longer than I thought it was. The trouble is there just isn't very good information, very good scheduling information online. You may actually have to go to the train station, physically go to the train station to find out what the trains are. And this is true throughout all of the poorer countries of Eastern Europe. So Odessa is on the Black Sea. Because of my glitch with the train ride, I only had about 6 hours to tour Odessa. I was impressed by how many bodies, this was June, and I was impressed by how many bodies were on the beach in Odessa. So my reason for going to Odessa is that I wanted to take a train to Moldova, tiny little country wedged between Romania and Ukraine. There was an international train from Odessa to Moldova. It was a kind of a rickety thing. It was just a rail car, really, wooden benches. But it got me there for a very reasonable price. When traveling to Moldova, you pass through a disputed area called Transnistria, which is a strip of land that should belong to Moldova. It's recognized only by Russia, that sees itself as an independent entity. And the train passes right over it. There's no formalities. There's no issue really in passing over it. The train may stop at one city in Transnistria. The only thing you need to know is that your passport does not get stamped when you're entering Moldova. And this may be an issue when you try to leave Moldova. So I flew out of Moldova, and the customs agents wanted me to know where my entry stamp was. And they told me that once I got to Moldova, I should have come to the airport to get an entry stamp there. So it's all kind of complicated. I'm not sure whether you should take a train from Odessa to Moldova because of that complication, but it's certainly safe and it was certainly cheap. Once I got to Moldova, what is there to say about Moldova? Well, it looks like Ukraine and it looks like Romania. It just happens to be an independent country. The language there is Romanian. The alphabet there is Roman. I wandered all around the capital city of Moldova, which is Chisinau, Moldova. It's got shopping malls. It's got the only thing I really remember is a museum that is housed in an old water tower. I remember walking around some nice parks. Really hard to find much to do in Moldova. One day there is probably sufficient. I had planned to take a train from Moldova to Bucharest, but I get to the train station to buy my ticket, and I find the train only runs 3 days a week. So how do I get to Bucharest? I ended up having to fly. So I booked a flight on the day of my departure. It wasn't that expensive, $100 or so. Booking on the day of departure a flight. You can do a lot cheaper, I'm sure, if you book in advance. But it was kind of, again, one of these surprises where you can't find schedules for the train online. You have to go to the train station to find out when the train actually runs. Bucharest, Romania. I've spent a lot of time in Romania. I've rented cars in Romania several times. Traveled by train in Romania. Romania is very nice. It has lots of nice mountains. The best mountains of Romania are in Transylvania. That's why you want to go to Romania, of course, is for Transylvania and all the vampires. You can follow in the steps of Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler, the most famous guy in all Romania. But first, let's hit Bucharest. Bucharest is a victim of the Ceausescu regime, which kind of bulldozed most of the city, most of the old city, and put up this really nasty, this nasty Soviet-style architecture. The Parliament House of Bucharest is one of the biggest buildings in the world. I think the second biggest after the Pentagon in the USA. It's a hideous thing. I wanted to take a tour, but the schedules weren't right. I didn't really feel the need to take a tour of the Parliament House. Bucharest is not a fun city. It's big blockish architecture. The old city is very small. I do not find Bucharest charming at all, unless you're into decrepit Soviet architecture, in which case there's probably some abandoned stuff too. But I would not dwell in Bucharest for very long. Bucharest, however, would be the place to rent a car to see the rest of Romania. You have to be conscious that there are two airports in Bucharest. You want to make sure you're renting your car at the right one. Cars are relatively inexpensive. So from Bucharest, you can explore the mountains. You can also explore, let's say, the high points of Transylvania by public transit. In fact, I did that on my first visit to Romania. I came by train. I visit Sighisoara, a nice medieval village, which is where Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler, was born. And I also visited Brasov, which is close to Dracula's castle, which is a beautiful medieval castle that Dracula himself probably never stayed at and probably never owned. He never owned that property, and if he stayed in that castle or the precursor to that castle, it was for only a night or two. But Dracula's castle is a tourist trap. It is surrounded by all sorts of sellers selling Dracula merchandise. It's totally hokey. But it's definitely a beautiful castle, and it's definitely something I recommend whilst in Romania. But if you want to see the real Dracula, if you want to get in touch with a real impaler, this guy who impaled his enemies on stakes and whose cruelty knew no bounds, this is a real historical character that Dracula is based on, Vlad Tepes. If you want to see really get in touch with his cruelty, you want to visit his personal fortress, the one he actually built. I forget the name of this fortress, but it is a long drive. It's maybe an hour's drive away from Dracula's castle is Dracula's fortress. And there you can climb up and see the remains of the fortress that was built with the blood of Vlad's enemies. So he reportedly worked his enemies to death. The people, the families that opposed him, he worked to death building this fortress. So Vlad, if you did something bad to Vlad, if you offended Vlad Tepes, he would not only torture you, he would torture your entire family. He would work them to death building this here fortress. So that's a place you can really only visit by rental car, whereas you can get to Bran Castle, Dracula's castle, by public transportation. You can stay in a hostel in Brasov and take a local bus to Dracula's castle. So there are lots of nice castles in Romania. I think southern Romania, the Transylvania region, is mountainous. It's very interesting. It's a cool place to visit. I said there was a salt mine in Krakow, Poland. There's also another nice salt mine in in Romania called Salida Turda. You need a rental car to get there. Again, there's a lot of structures underground. What there is in Salida Turda is a whole amusement park underground in the chambers of the salt mine. So I recommend visiting if you have a rental car and you're in the Transylvania area. Salida Turda, I think, is an hour away or so, an hour or two from Bran Castle, from Dracula's castle. So I do recommend Romania. I recommend after Prague, after you've seen Prague, I do recommend Transylvania. Just stop in on Transylvania. And you only visit Bucharest if you need to rent a car or change trains. The language of Romania is Romanian, which is a Romance language. In other words, it's related to Italy and France. So if you know some Italian or some French, it's pretty easy to decode some signs and things in Romanian. Romanian is understandable for an English speaker or a French. If you know some high school French, you can decode a lot of Romanian, which is not true for the next country over, Hungary. You're not going to decode any of their language because their language in Hungary comes from Asia. It's not an Indo-European language at all. It's not related to German or to French, to Latin, or anything else. There's nothing you could decode. And I learned this the first time I visited Budapest who's to Bucharest, Romania. You could take a train from Bucharest to Budapest. Budapest is a very beautiful city. Not as beautiful as Prague, but a city you want to spend some time in, a city you want to rent a bicycle in because it's a spread out city. There is a fortress on a hill overlooking the river. You could spend 2 or 3 days. You can, I would say you could be amused for 4 days in Budapest, but 2 or 3 days are enough. Now, as I say, the language is indecipherable. I learned this on my first visit to Budapest when I arrived by train, and I went to the toilets. This was early 90s, and we really hadn't modernized as much. I went to the train station. I went to use the toilet, the restrooms, and one of them is labeled Furfi, F-E-R-F-I, and the other is labeled Noi, N-O-I. So which am I? Am I a Furfi or a Noi? And there were none of these graphic symbols at the time for men and women. So should I walk into the Furfi bathroom or the Noi bathroom? And I ended up just having to stand there at the door and wait till somebody came out to tell me which gender that bathroom was. So signs are very difficult in Budapest. But again, you're going to get by. Modern times, you're going to get by in English. Any place you need to get anything done, you can get by in English with some pointing if you need to. I may have driven around in a rental car in Hungary, but I don't remember much of it. And I can't remember any particular attractions outside of Budapest. So you'll have to Google for that to see if there are any attractions in Hungary. In the Balkans, there's a lot of little countries there. My memory is a little hazy. South of Austria and probably connecting to Hungary is Slovenia. First, the northernmost of the Baltic states. Slovenia is where Melania Trump comes from. That's their claim to fame or infamy. Ljubljana is the capital of Slovenia. It's a nice capital, a nice place to walk around, not particularly memorable. A more memorable site in Slovenia is Bled, B-L-E-D, a medieval town of Bled. It's on a lake, and in the middle of the lake is a castle. There are no motorboats on the lake. You can rent a rowboat and row out to the castle. You've seen photos of this castle, I'm sure. So that's kind of the central tourist attraction of Slovenia. Slovenia was the only Balkan country Balkan meaning formerly part of Czechoslovakia, which included a lot of countries that have split up now. It's the only country that was not touched, relatively untouched by the war in the 1990s. So after the fall of communism, Czechoslovakia broke up into all these little tribal units that fought with each other. Serbia gained most of the weapons left over by the Soviet in the Soviet era, and the Serbians were kind of the oppressors. They had all the weapons and was kind of the... I don't want to get into the politics of the Balkan wars, but there was a war, big wars in the 1990s. Those wars are solved. Everything is hunky-dory now. You can now feel safe to travel in the Balkans. These are not wealthy countries, but I feel comfortable and safe there, and there's a lot of things to see. South of Slovenia is Croatia. Croatia is a funny shaped country, has a lot of coastline, and the coast kind of jets in. You'll have to look at a map of Croatia to see what I'm talking about. Zagreb, a nice city. Not a lot of things that are memorable. But in Croatia, I've had occasion to rent a car in Croatia and visit a lot of the towns of Croatia. The most spectacular, of course, is Dubrovnik, a big tourist town. It's a walled fortress city on the ocean, on the Mediterranean. It's heavily touristed, but still it's a really cool city, and I would go there. That's a top attraction in Croatia. There are a lot of other cities along the coast, the Adriatic coast in Croatia. It's really nice to rent a car. If you do rent a car, you pass through a little neck of Bosnia. That's not an issue at all. There may be a customs checkpoint where they just look at your passport or just wave you through. It's not crossing Bosnia, a little bit of Bosnia between two parts of Croatia is not an issue at all. But I rented a car in Zagreb, drove throughout to some of Bosnia. My first visit to Bosnia was by train. An all-day train ride from Zagreb to Sarajevo was only about $20. Sarajevo is a very nice city. In fact, that is one of my high recommendations. I said after Prague, Transylvania, and maybe after Transylvania, Sarajevo. It's a nice city that's wedged into a valley and a narrow gorge. It's interesting for that, but it's also interesting for its history in the 1990s, how it was the subject of a siege in the 1990s, where the Serbian forces took up emplacements on the mountaintops overlooking Sarajevo and bombarded it for an extended period of time until the NATO forces finally chased them out. That's a significant part of the history of Sarajevo, and why you would want to visit Sarajevo is to catch up on that history. It's also the place where Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated, leading to World War I. You can visit the bridge where that happened. While in Sarajevo, you want to take a tour of the tunnels. From the main tourist office, you can take a day tour of the tunnels that help supply Sarajevo. To get supplies into the city was under siege, and the only way to get supplies in was through a tunnel from the airport. And you can visit this tunnel or a remnant of this tunnel, which is highly recommended. After you visit Sarajevo, you can go over and visit the other side of the story, the other side of the story by taking a train to Belgrade. You can either fly or take a train. If you take a train, the train goes north to Croatia and then goes west to Belgrade, to Serbia, because there's no direct train connection between Sarajevo and Serbia. You have to cut through Croatia. Serbia, I've not seen any of Serbia apart from Belgrade. Nice town. The most memorable thing about Belgrade was visiting the military museum there and getting the Serbian side of the story of the siege of Sarajevo and the Balkan Wars. You get the Serbian side of how they were not the aggressors at all, but that NATO was the aggressor. You learn that in the Serbian Military Museum. At the very south of Serbia is a little country recognized by most of the world, but not recognized by Russia, a newest country in Europe called Kosovo. You may associate Kosovo with a lot of ethnic strife, a lot of violence that has passed. And it's a good place to visit. You can only get there by bus. You get there by bus from either Albania or Macedonia. It's not practical. I don't think it's practical to get there from Serbia. Kosovo was kind of carved out of Serbia. And I think it's a Muslim area where Serbia is Christian, as I recall. Anyway, the capital of Kosovo is Pristina. I found no hostels in Pristina, which is kind of surprising to me. This was 4 years ago. Maybe they're hostels now. So I stayed in a guest house. Again, it wasn't very expensive. It was like $25. I rented a car for 24 hours in Kosovo, which is just enough time to see a gorge. I forget the name of the gorge. It's west of Kosovo, of Raguva Gorge. And I also visited the second city of Prizren. Prizren, I think, in Kosovo. Another nice, older medieval city. I do recall mosques in Prizren as opposed to churches that you would find in Serbia. Next to Kosovo is Albania. Albania is very poor. You will see it in the countryside. I rode a bus in Albania from Kosovo to Albania. Someone who was sitting beside me pointed out to some of the work camps. Albania was a very oppressive regime back in the day, one of the last communist regimes to fall. Albania, pleasant enough. Just not a lot to say about it. The capital of Albania is Tirana. Not a lot to say about it. I stayed at a nice hostel there. Not a high priority place to visit. Sometime I'd like to rent a car and see more of the countryside, but the countryside, I'm sure, is very poor. Of all of these countries, you see a lot of fields that are tended by hand, grain fields that are harvested by hand, big piles of grain in the fields. You see horse-drawn carriages carrying agricultural products. So the poverty is evident in Albania, but I feel no great danger in Albania. Whenever you travel through a very poor area, you do have to be kind of circumspect. You don't flash your fancy electronics around just because you don't want them stolen and because it's bad form to show too much wealth. Next to Albania is Montenegro. The only place that I've seen in Montenegro is the resort town of Budva. It's got a nice, I think there's a castle or something in Budva. The nice beaches. I mean, beaches are relative. Any beach that you find in Eastern Europe is kind of a beach in quotes because they tend to be very gravelly, very rocky beaches on the Adriatic coast. And on the Black Sea, these are rocky beaches. These aren't nice, pristine white sand beaches unless someone has trucked in white sand for the purpose. South of Serbia is Macedonia. The only thing I've seen of Macedonia is the capital, Skopje. Skopje it's an interesting city. It has, in the center city, there are a lot of statues to local heroes. I walked through a marketplace on the other side of the river from the main square is a marketplace. A lot of dense market activity. It's almost like what you would think of in the Middle East, people with stalls and selling all sorts of wares in a very dense, crowded environment. That's all I remember of Macedonia. I came to Macedonia from Thessaloniki, the second city of Greece. I took a bus into Macedonia and then took another bus into Kosovo. So I think I've covered all of those Balkan states, those states that used to be part of Czechoslovakia. Going south now, let's first go east now to Bulgaria. And I happen to be in Bulgaria as we speak. I'm in a hostel, the Hostel Mostel in Veliko Tarnovo, Bulgaria. And I'm really enjoying it here. I'm staying another night because I like this hostel so much, and I like this garden. I was going to film this video in some tourist part of the city, but I like this garden so much that I'm filming this video here in the courtyard of Hostel Mostel. So Bulgaria, what is to say about Bulgaria? I've been to Sofia a couple of times, and this is my first rental car tour of Bulgaria. Sofia is a pleasant enough city, worth a day, but not much more than a day. Nice hostel. You can stay in the Hostel Mostel in Sofia, but mainly I stayed there this time just to rent a car and drive around. I know that the rental car is only good in Bulgaria, but it's very cheap. Bulgaria has mountains in the east. I'm in the mountains now. Again, lots of interesting relief. The interesting towns, the interesting medieval towns are in mountainous regions. There's also a lot of abandonment in Bulgaria. There's so many abandoned buildings that even the graffiti artists have run out of energy. Look at this pristine wall right in near a downtown area. No graffiti at all. It's like even the graffiti artists have left the country. So a lot of decrepitude in Bulgaria, but it's kind of rustic and scenic and kind of interesting. The main roads between towns are pretty good. The local roads can be pretty rough. A lot of dirt roads in rural communities. I wish I could tell you more about Bulgaria, but I'm only halfway into my tour. I hope to get to the coast, tell you something about the coast. I can't tell you anything about the coast until I get there. Going from Bulgaria borders Romania. Is it Romania? And it borders the Black Sea, and it borders Turkey and Greece. So first let's hit Greece. I've spent a fair amount of time in Greece. My favorite part of Greece is the Greek island of Santorini. And you've seen the island of Santorini in calendars. And this is the perfect calendar picture. Shows these blue domed churches and whitewashed blockish houses kind of tumbling down a hillside. You've seen this picture many times of Santorini, of a village of Ia, that's I-A, in Santorini, or the main village of Thira, Thira, in Santorini. And you can either fly into Santorini, or you can take a ferry from Athens into Santorini. So one time, I loved Santorini so much that one time I decided I would just go there and hang out in a hostel. At the time, there was a nice hostel in Ia. It's not there anymore. And I decided I would just stay there as long. I thought it was paradise, and I thought I would stay there as long as I wanted. And I lasted about a week, and that a week is enough of paradise you can handle. It really is a paradise. It's a tourist paradise. It is crawling with tourists. There are all the signs are in English with Greek subtitles. Everyone speaks English. The euro is the currency in Greece. It's easy to There are plenty of things to do. There are museums, there's beaches, there's jumping off of cliffs into water. There you can rent mopeds, motor quad runners. Everything for the tourists is there in Santorini. And there are hostels there. The beautiful hostel that I used to stay at in Ia is not there anymore, but there are hostels in Thera. So you can go to Santorini for a relatively low price. There are many other Greek islands. I would like to visit more of them. I've only dabbled in those other Greek islands. I can't tell you anything about them. I've never been to Crete. I'd like to go to Crete. But I have driven around. I've been to Athens many times, and I've driven a rental car around mainland Greece. Athens is a must-see. You must eventually get to Athens. You must climb the Acropolis and see the museums of antiquities at the base of the Acropolis. Greece is having some hard times now, hard economic times. The central tourist districts still seem to be maintained pretty well, but there are hard times in Greece. In some towns, you see trash not being picked up. But I don't really think this affects. The one thing that is booming in Greece right now is tourism, and you can still drive comfortably. You can still comfortably travel around in Greece. I went to Sparta, home of the Spartan warriors, and saw the remains of the Spartan civilization. There's a museum of Sparta in the city of Sparta. I don't think it's stunning enough to really recommend it, but it's nice to have visited Sparta. I also visited Mount Olympus, which is the place of the gods. And you find this is quite a substantial mountain that mortals cannot climb. It was only around 1900 that anyone had reached the summit of Mount Olympus, which is why the gods reside there, because nobody could get there. Now people do climb on a regular basis, but it's not the sort of mountain you want to climb for people like you and me. Thessaloniki is the second city in Greece, and I've been there several times. Don't remember much about it. Supermarkets, it's a nice downtown. I just don't remember anything about it, which is a bad sign. If I don't remember anything, then probably isn't worth going there. Turkey, I consider part of Eastern Europe. It was never under Soviet domination, but it's getting more and more totalitarian every day. Been to Istanbul many times. I'm not ready to go back. My last time in Istanbul was in 2013 during the Gezi Park protests against the government by students and everyone else in the center part of Istanbul. It was like Woodstock. It was like the Woodstock of Turkey. It was just an amazing thing to be a part of until the government broke it up with tear gas. And I was there for the tear gassing. I smelled the tear gas. I was involved in this failed democratic uprising. And Turkey is becoming more and more totalitarian every day. And that's why I don't go back there. One of the reasons is they now require a visa for tourists in Turkey. You used to be able to get your visa on arrival in Turkey. It's just a stamp in your passport. Now you need to prearrange your visa to Turkey. And that's enough to tell me I don't need to go there anymore. I have a lot of friends in Turkey. I have a lot of sympathy for the people in Turkey. I know Turkey needs tourism, but I just don't want to go there right now. It's too painful for me to go there right now. Not saying that you shouldn't go there. I mean, Istanbul is a very scenic city. You're going to be hustled when you go to the tourist areas, like around the Sofia. What is the Sofia? The Hagia Sophia, the main tourist attraction in Istanbul. You're going to be hustled at every street corner by hawkers. And what they typically they do is they ask you in English, where are you from? Where are you from? And they won't accept a non-answer. And these are very aggressive, the sort of aggressive hawkers that you would expect in North Africa or Egypt. They are there in Istanbul. That's kind of unpleasant, but that's only in the central tourist district. So if not for their oppressive regime, I would be recommending Istanbul. Now I think you should be cautious and don't hit Istanbul until you've seen the rest of Eastern Europe. So, have I covered every little country, every little nook and cranny of Eastern Europe? I haven't done Russia, we know about that, but I think I've covered every other little country. Any micro countries that I've forgotten about? No, I don't think so. So, that's my superficial guide to Eastern Europe. Presumably, at some point, I'll put out a video on Western Europe, which is different. As I say, London, Paris, Rome. Hit those towns before you hit Eastern Europe, because Eastern Europe is kind of an acquired taste. I think you want to earn your European sea legs in Western Europe first. Oh. Nice little courtyard here. I like it here.